we are going to have a fun class tonight. As I was looking over the material this week, there is actually a lot to cover as far as archaeological evidence for the Davidic and Solomonic kingdom. So I think we're going to continue along that vein. Next week, we will be taking a bye week, so we'll have next week off. And then the following week, when we come back, we're going to get into the effacement judgment, and then into the evidence of that judgment being rendered against Israel with the many Assyrian deportations and then later Babylonian deportations. So those are going to get into a lot of really good solid history. As we come later and later into the monarchy era, there is just simply more and more epigraphic inscriptions, that would be written inscriptions, that we have to go on. So that's going to be a lot of fun going through that. So tonight, let me go ahead and bring my thing up. Okay, hold on, I'm not seeing. So let me go and enable my PowerPoint again. I went ahead and shut down before we loaded today, just so that we didn't have the sound problems that we did last week. I wanted to keep Minnie Mouse at bay. So I did indeed shut down before we came. And so now let me enable this again. Friday evenings are always fun, trying to get the kids settled and fed and all of that. So let me see here. As soon as we have this, we should be ready to go. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and enable. There it is. All right, and there is our PowerPoint. So as soon as I see that come up, we will proceed. We are now in chapter 12. This is a transition chapter as we go from King David and King Solomon, the early monarchy, into some more of the theological as well as prophetic topics within the Torah. So the first thing I wanted to discuss tonight were the extent and limit of the Davidic kingdom. And not just really the Davidic kingdom, but more than that. The promise that was given to Abraham regarding the borders of Israel. This one has it going a little further north into Syria. This map is not wholly correct. The true borders, if you can see my mouse, would have been here right along the bottom of the Euphrates River, gone right over into modern day Lebanon, and then it would have gone down into Egypt. Israel actually would have retained part of the Sinai Peninsula, perhaps all of it. And right here, if you can see my mouse, there was a branch of the Nile that has since silted up. It was called the Palusic branch of the Nile. And this really would have been Israel's southern border. Israel retained the land of Goshen. She retained Sharhuan. She retained actually the land of her captivity. So this is a very generous map regarding Israel's borders. It really would have been a little bit further south than this, and really would not have proceeded as far north as Turkey. But this kind of gives you a good idea as to the extent of the Davidic kingdom under David and Solomon. Let me go to the next one here. One of the inscriptions, as we come into the evidence for the time of David, it's really fascinating how all of a sudden, once you have a stable ruling faction within Israel, that all of a sudden the archaeology becomes a lot more stable as well. This, what you are looking at in this slide, is often erroneously referred to as the Goliath inscription. The phonetics is something similar to Elwith. So it is a word that corresponds, perhaps is an etymology to the word Goliath, but it is not the same. This particular pottery shard was excavated at Gath. This would have been Goliath's hometown. And it was excavated between the 10th to 9th centuries BCE. So this would have been somewhere around possibly 1000 BCE all the way down to probably about 850 BCE, somewhere around in there. And the reason that this is important is that we do find names that are similar to Goliath at this point in time. Names such as these do not appear in Israel's later history. I have often spoke regarding the phenomenon that you see throughout history where certain names excel in popularity and then they fall into disuse. That is really what we are finding here. A name similar to Goliath appears in the city of Gath, and it's really not attested to at any other point in time. We find that there are Philistine layers at Gath, and then on top of those, there are Israelite layers of occupation. This particular pottery shard is in what they call a Proto-Semitic script, and this would have been the script that was used in the early monarchy. From the time of Samuel, probably all the way down to Solomon, would have used this script until probably the scribes under an official scribal school would have developed something a little bit more formal. The second artifact that we're going to look at tonight is going to be the Ishbal inscription. And this was written on a wine jug. And this just say Ishbal, son of Banah. And this is fascinating again because we have another contemporary name. Now, you might have seen a lot of things on the internet regarding Ishbal and in this particular jug being ascribed specifically to Ishbal, the son of King Saul. That is not wholly correct. It was a jug that was probably held by a very wealthy person. It also shows that the name Ishbal was very popular at this point in time. This artifact again dates right around the 10th century BCE, so somewhere probably between about 1000 BCE all the way down to about 900 BCE. Now, the reason this is important is because, like the name of Goliath or like the name David or even the name Gideon, you find that these are very popular and very contemporary, but then they fall into disuse and they are never used again. The name Ishbaal is especially meaningful for Israel. It means the man of Baal. Now, scholars argue that within Israel's scribal schools, they argue there was the Elohim school, there was the Yahweh school, and so they view that the Yahweh school would not use the word Baal because it was prohibited in the Torah. So rather than referring to Saul's son as Ishbaal, they would refer to him as Ishbosheth. And what this meant was, it meant shame. So rather than being the man of Baal, the term is then turned into the man of shame. So this was a slight, and we'll get into this more next week, but one of the things that you see Israel's scribes doing throughout Israel's recorded history is they would marginalize or they would defame certain people. The idea of commemorating and putting somebody's life down in memory was considered something that was Kodesh. It was a very holy event to record someone's history, to recognize their contribution to Israel's ongoing history. And the scribes, they viewed their job as something that was very, very unique and very special in the eyes of Yahweh. So they would often, it was their divine commission to recognize the good and to recognize the evil. And they would often slight or expunge the evil within their written biographies or their written history of Israel's ongoing monarchy. Now, today we might call this propaganda. We might call this rewriting history. But for the scribe, you have to remember that their job was to commemorate those that contributed in either a positive or negative way. This is why you see so many of the kings in Israel's history being remembered by a very formulatic statement. And that statement was, such and such king did that which was right in the eyes of Yahweh, or the converse, such and such king did that which was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. So this is the scribe's divine right. It is his commission to glorify the righteous and then to expunge or to demonize, as you would, the wicked within Israel. Now, this particular artifact, again, should not be equated with directly with Saul's son. It is possible, but it probably is not his wine jug. But it does show that the name was contemporary in Israel at this point in time. So when we read the biblical accounts, we do find evidence to support that name being popular in the 10th century. Now, the next artifact that we're going to look at, or rather the next excavation that we're going to see, is David's palace and the Milo. We are told in 2 Samuel 5:11 and again in 2 Samuel 11, we are told about David's palace and the Milo that is built. We're told that King Hiram sent him building materials for him to build this. And these are part of 2 monuments that lie south of the Temple Mount. These are under the directorship of the city of David, and Mazar is the archaeologist that heads up the excavation there. But what this shows is that when scripture states that David's palace was built at a particular point in time, we do indeed find very large structures that coincide to a palace dwelling. We actually find archaeological evidence for that again in the 10th century. This is a replica of the city of David. If you've ever been to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, this is to the right. If you're facing the museum, this is kind of in the outside to the right. It is a reconstruction of David and what it would have looked like in the 10th period. There was a cistern that was that really kind of fed the entire city. It would have been right over in here. You can see where this jets out a little bit, and it would have covered that cistern and protected it for the people. This was a previous Canaanite stronghold. The Jebusites had been here, and then David took it very early in his reign. Now, another evidence that we have for the biblical record regards Toi, the king of Hamath. He is referenced in 2 Samuel 8:10, and archaeological excavations within the last 20 years have uncovered this King Attiah of Hamath. He formed a kingdom that was known as Pelitzar. You know, some people erroneously equate this with the Philistines. It was not a Philistine stronghold, but it would have been there on the Aramean front between Syria and Tyre and Israel. But what this shows, the fact that we have it, I'm going to show you where this statute was found, because it is found in Aleppo, Syria. But this is a reference to a king that is mentioned in the Bible. So the fact that we have excavated it, the fact that it dates to the 10th century, this again bolsters the historicity of the biblical claim. Now, the claim in scripture is that, and I'm just going to go ahead and read this, David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer. He sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and to congratulate him on defeating Hadassah in battle. For Hadassah had been at war with Toi. Now, this Toi, again, would have been on the northernmost front for Israel. And Israel eventually took Hamath as a tribute city. They may have occupied the city, but they would not have controlled the territory at all. They really just would have controlled a port city. They would have received tribute from the trade that proceeded through that port. So it was a way of making Israel very wealthy. Now, the inscription that we know that this was a place for King Toi was the fact that we have uncovered a statue. It was in a Luwian language, and it was discovered during the excavations in 2003. So this is now how we can confirm another part of the biblical narrative. And this is just, you will see a modern chair in the front. This is just simply an excavation site where this statue was found. Another inscription that you guys are probably very familiar with that attests to the kingdom of David is going to be the Tel Dan inscription. Now, you will see it in white, and this is a reference to the house of David. Now, the reason that this is important is because up until this inscription was found in the early 1990s, it was thought that the house of David was something that was manufactured. It never existed. It was just a figment of everyone's imagination. But with the discovery of this stone, it became clear that with the Tel Dan inscription, that there actually was a kingdom of David. And so this really helped to bolster at least the Davidic monarchy and Solomon within the eyes of modern day scholars. We have something in stone. Now, this particular stone is called the Tel Dan inscription because it was broken up and reused within the walls at the modern site that is known as Tel Dan. It would have been an Israelite city in the north. It's in a very beautiful part of northern Israel. There's palm trees. There is a river that runs nearby. So it's a very beautiful place, but the people that lived at Tel Dan had raided Hazael and had confiscated this stone that was probably set up in a very public place. They had destroyed it and later used it as building in their own cities, as a wall in their city. And this is what it states in the Tel Dan inscription. It states, I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Aziahu, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David, and I set their towns in ruins and their land into desolation. So this inscription claims and boasts of a great battle, not just a battle, but of great success in the campaign against Israel. And this would have been King Hazael. This text was very broken. It was very fragmented. And so this places this text right at, you would have had Solomon, and this would have been about 100 years after Solomon. So within the 8th century. But this, again, is more evidence that we have for ancient Israel's history. Now, coming to a very fun part of Israel's history, and this is Khirbet Qeiyafa. This city is significant because it is one of the few cities in that we have or that archaeologists have discovered in ancient Israel that have 2 gates to the city. This city is specifically mentioned in Scripture. It was a city that would have been owned by Judah. The Valley of Elah is outside of this, and this is really where you would have had David and Goliath fighting, would have been outside of this city. Now, this city would not have existed during the time of David and Goliath, except as far as it just would have been a very small city, perhaps a Philistine stronghold in prior times. After David, it is turned into an administrative city, and you find that it becomes a very important city within the time of Solomon and later in Israel's history. The other reason, and you will see this yellow circle on the bottom left, the other reason this city comes to important is because of an administrative document that was found here. And this is called the Caiaphas shard. And this particular pottery shard is a king's instruction to the people of the city. And he exhorts the administration, the judges of the city, to judge righteously. And this is some of the things that it says. It says, you shall not do it, but worship Yahweh. And again, anytime you see bracketed words, those are places where an inscription or a pottery shard writing are damaged, or perhaps it is too faded to totally make out what the word is, so you have to reconstruct it to the best of your ability. And that's what scholars have done with this pottery shard. So the second command says, judge the slave and the widow, judge the orphan, and judge the stranger, plead for the infant, plead for the poor and the widow, rehabilitate the poor at the hands of the king, protect the poor and the slave, and support the stranger. Now, all of these are commands from the Torah. Every single one of these can be found within the instructions of Torah. So what you find is that the early kings of the monarchy are upholding the words of Torah. We had talked about Ishbaal before. What's fascinating in Israel's history is that the word Baal, as part of people's names within the land of Israel, you really don't find that theophoric name being attached to the names of Israelites after the reign of King David. It really falls into disuse. The only time that you really find it is when Israel comes into strangers, and then you find it later in Israel's history as well. You find it like in the names of Jezebel, but from the early monarchy period, you do not find the name of Baal within the people's names. It really becomes something that where the theophoric of Yahweh or Jehovah, often it's used as Yahweh, is used within the king's names throughout the monarchy period. So this shows a direct break in the customs of perhaps the judges era and the gods that they would have served in the judges era, as the monarchy brings everyone into one religion and into the constitution of Torah is really what they are doing. So with this, you find that, you know, you have heard probably some arguments that the Torah was written very late in Israel's history. Well, this, the Caiaphas shard, shows that much of Israel's history, as far as the Torah is concerned, that those ideas were ingrained and embedded in Israel's, into her value system very early in the nation's history. And it is very likely that they stemmed from a prior written document, i.e. the Torah that was given at Sinai. So the next thing we're going to look at is going to be King Solomon's palace at Gezer. Now, this is a later archaeological discovery. It was actually just released this summer. And this is fascinating because of the fact that the features of this complex show that it is a palace, but more than this, it is built very similar to Solomon's structures at Megiddo and at Hatzor. We also find that underneath this structure, or in earlier layers, that this had been a Philistine stronghold prior to Solomon's maintaining of it. We also find that the Philistine, the lower layers of Philistine occupation show a very strong connection to Cyprus. So when we come and we ask who are the Philistines, the archaeology is showing that the Philistines had very strong ties to the Aegean and specifically to the island of Cyprus. Now, the Bible tells us that when Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, that that Pharaoh gave Solomon the city of Gezer as a present. It had been captured, burned with fire. He had killed the Canaanites who were dwelling in the city, and he gave it as a parting gift to his daughter. We're told in 1 Kings 9, verses 16 and 17, that Solomon built up Gezer. And, there is evidence for this as we are uncovering. The city was destroyed in the later Iron Age, perhaps with the invasion of Shoshenq of Egypt under Rehoboam. So, there is question as to the duration and how long this palace was actually inhabited. It is possible it could have been the queen's palace if it was given to her by her father. That would have been King Solomon's wife. And so we find that the city existed until Shoshenq's invasions in 925. And we also find that the palace, when it was excavated, was virtually deserted. There really was not any wealth or any housing artifacts left in the palace. So it's as though it had been deserted in anticipation of an assault on the complex. So what we find from the archaeological record from Gezer and even from Quebec Qaiyafa, both of those are confirming the biblical narrative. They really do not contradict it whatsoever. Now, the next thing, and this is actually going to be the last thing that we are going to look at tonight. This is going to kind of be a short class, simply because I didn't want to get into the effacement judgment before we got into Assyria's invasion. So we're going to look at that all together in 2 weeks. So with the Mesha stone, this was built by King Mesha. It is also known as the Moabite stone. And let me just read to you. I didn't put this up in the slides tonight because it was really a lot of text. But let me just read to you what this stone says. The stone tells that Mesha had attacked the house of David, and he reports conquering Israel's territory just east of the Jordan. Mesha purports to have captured the vessels of Yahweh, and he also states that he had subjugated Israel, specifically the house of Omri, and he mentions Ahab as well. This is what King Mesha tells us. He says, I have built this sanctuary for Chemosh in Karkak, a sanctuary of salvation, for he saved me from all aggressors and made me look upon mine enemies with contempt. Omri was king of Israel and oppressed Moab during many days, and Chemosh was angry with his aggressions. His son succeeded him, and he also said, I will oppress Moab. In my days, he said, let us go, and I will see my desires upon him and his house. And Israel said, I shall destroy it forever. Now Omri took the land of Medeba and occupied it in his day. And in his days the son 40 years, and his son for 40 years. And Chemosh had mercy on it in my time. And I built Baal Menon and made therein a ditch. And I built Kerathim. And the men of Gad dwelt in the country of Erethoth from ancient times. And the king of Israel fortified Eretoth. And I assaulted the wall and captured it, and killed all the warriors of this city, from the well-pleasing of Chemosh and Moab. And I removed from it all the spoil, and offered it before Chemosh in Kirjath. And I placed therein men of Siran, and the men of Mechroth. And Chemosh said to me, Go, take Nebo against Israel. And I went in the night, and I fought against it from the daybreak till noon, and I took it. And I killed all 7,000 men, but I did not kill the women and maidens, for I devoted them to Ashtar Chemosh. And I took it from the vessels of Yahweh, and offered them before Chemosh. And the king of Israel fortified Yahaz, and occupied it. And when he had made war against me, and Chemosh drove him out before me, and I took from Moab 200 men in all. And at that point, the text becomes fragmentary. So we are told also in scripture that it was during Ahab's days that Moab revolted. So what we are seeing is a parallel history unfold, both within different inscriptions that have been excavated over the past 150 years, and the biblical narrative. To date, we really have not found anything that contradicts what is written in King Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. Now, we may not have the complete story, and oftentimes we are told a different part of the story than what we are told in Scripture. So many times, what Scripture does is it gives us one little lens. We are looking at one little corner to a much bigger picture. We are told how things affect Israel, how they affect the administration for Israel. We're not often told all the other political haggling or the political situation that really exist in the background behind these stories, the rest of the story with Scripture. So this is just finishing up the overview. We are now in chapter 12, and we are going to be continuing in chapter 12 next week. Next week we are, I'm sorry, in 2 weeks, because we are taking a week off next week. In 2 weeks, we are going to look at the effacement judgment and why that was so important, why it was so important for Canaan's conquest, why it was important for the Davidic era, and then why, because Israel did not obey that command, it really came back to haunt them. And it is the reason why we then see Assyria deporting Israel off the land, both Israel and Judah. So this was a short class tonight. I'm glad you guys stuck it out while we worked out some of the issues with chat. And if there's any questions, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. And I thank you guys for joining me tonight. I always enjoy these times together. And like I said, I have been under the weather this week, so if I'm a little nasal, that is why. And next week, we're going to get into a lot of Assyrian history and see, again, you know, in previous classes, we focused a lot on Egypt. And the reason for that is because that is the nation that provides the greatest parallel with ancient Israel and the history there. But now what we're going to see is kind of a shift away from Egypt and to Assyria. And then as we go through the parallel Assyrian history and we see how the reign of Shalmaneser corresponds with the reign of Jehu, all of that is going to shed light and give us a better understanding for ancient Israel's history. And then what we're going to find as we come into chapter 13 is that this history within Israel then allows us to understand the prophecies, not just within Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets, but also the prophecies within the Torah, within Deuteronomy, Leviticus. We're going to find that those prophecies are illuminated by Israel's history. So this is where, you know, if you do find history kind of dry and boring, let me encourage you that it really is not, because it is those histories that then grant the credibility to the prophecies written within the pages of Scripture. So if there's no questions, I'm going to give it just a minute. And again, thank you guys for joining me. I hope you will join me tomorrow morning for Roots of Faith at 10:30 a.m. And Roots of Faith is on YouTube tomorrow morning. So I hope you guys will join me. And thank you so much for being with me this evening. I hope you have a fantastic evening. Shabbat Shalom.